Today's true crime story involves three people: a very powerful Hollywood producer, a former pimp with such a shady past that people often described him as creepy, Playboy model caught in between them. What started as a glamorous love triangle quickly spiraled into something filled with obsession, control, and some very unsettling claims about Hugh Hefner. She was beautiful, famous, and living what looked like a dream. She was a rising star and a Playboy model, on the verge of becoming Hollywood's next big thing. This is the story of a young woman, a Canadian girl with a soft voice and a bright future, who was exploited by the man who claimed to love her. Or should I say, the men who claim to love her. Hi guys, I'm author Holly Mae Cormier. My first debut novel, Memphis, is available now. The links are in the description to purchase my novel. I'm currently working on book 2, Johnny, set to be released later this year. My book is about a woman who is exploited by her husband and sets on a journey to escape him, much like the story that we're going to be talking about today. So this story, the story of Dorothy Stratten, actually inspired my book, Memphis. This story and the keyword Dorothy Stratten continues to bring the most website traffic to my author website from one single blog post that I wrote about her over a year ago. That tells you something. It tells you that people are still very much affected by the loss of Dorothy Stratten. This case has been covered many times before. It's been discussed in films, documentaries, and books. But today I want to tell you about the story in a little bit of a different way. And in my style, I like to talk about warning signs and the psychology leading up to horrible crimes like this. So let's get into it. This is the story of Dorothy Stratten. Dorothy Ruth Stratten was born February 28, 1960, making her a Pisces. She was born in Vancouver, Canada. Her parents, Simon and Nellie, were immigrants from the Netherlands, building a quiet, modest life for their family. Dorothy grew up alongside her younger brother and sister. More on her sister later, because what I'm going to tell you about her little sister, Louise, it's going to be quite shocking, but we'll get into that later. So in what many would describe in Dorothy's upbringing was quite an ordinary home. But what stood out about Dorothy wasn't just her beauty, it was her personality. And like the typical Pisces traits, she was known to be soft-spoken, kind, and gentle. People who knew her described her as almost innocent. She was someone who didn't demand attention, but she just naturally drew attention to her because she was so beautiful, and she's one of those people who had a magnetic force about her. By the time she was a teenager, Dorothy was attending high school just outside of Vancouver, and she was balancing classes with a part-time job that she landed at a local Dairy Queen. Her life was simple, normal, it was safe, until one day, someone walked into that Dairy Queen. His name was Paul Snyder. He was 26 years old. Dorothy was 17 at the time of their meeting, and he was described as a man who understood the importance of image. He loved attention, opposite of Dorothy's personality. And of course, opposites often attract. And he was really there, and he was ready to sell a fantasy to Dorothy. While Dorothy was quiet and reserved, Snyder was ambitious, flashy, and calculating. And almost immediately, he saw something in young Dorothy, who was 9 years younger than him. He didn't just see her obvious beauty, but he saw opportunity. Remember, he is an opportunist. So they started dating, and right from the very beginning, the dynamic between them was not equal. Snyder didn't just want to be her boyfriend. He wanted to shape her, to mold her. He wanted to build Dorothy into something that he could profit from. So, not long after they met, Snyder arranged for professional photos of Dorothy. He did talk her into taking these risque photos, and according to Dorothy, in footage at an interview that she did, and I am going to show this footage later, it took her about 3 weeks to finally come around and see the opportunity by posing nude. So these photos would later be sent to Playboy magazine on the advice of course, Paul Snyder. So Dorothy was still under the legal age of majority in British Columbia, and Snyder had forged her mother's signature so she could travel to Los Angeles at the Playboy mansion where they were invited after seeing Dorothy's photos. And this was one of the earliest warning signs that there was control and manipulation to come. Clearly a disregard for boundaries. And yet it worked. So in August of 1978, Dorothy ended up moving to Los Angeles. And of course, Paul went with her. It was a turning point for her. She became a finalist in Playboy's 25th anniversary Playmate hunt, and she quickly stood out among the other participants for this contest. So her look was different. It wasn't just glamorous, but it was almost ethereal, as some people described her to be. And many people had compared her soft temperament, her sweet nature, and resemblance in her physical appearance to Marilyn Monroe. Very soon, she was chosen by Hugh Hefner and executives at Playboy magazine to be Playmate of the Month in August 1979. And then came something even bigger than that. She was crowned Playmate of the Year in 1980. So her career literally exploded overnight. She began working at the Playboy Club, and she landed roles in films and television shows like Buck Rogers and Fantasy Island. Even Hugh Hefner thought that she had great potential to cross over into Hollywood mainstream success. But behind the scenes, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. So, as Dorothy's star began to rise, people around her started to notice something troubling, and that was Snyder's behavior. He had a need for control. He had intense jealousy, and honestly, a lot of people described him as creepy. Playboy staff had reportedly asked Dorothy to start distancing herself away from him. Friends had warned her. Even those closest to her could see the imbalance between these two. And according to accounts, Hugh Hefner himself had tried to warn her about the creepy vibes that they were getting from Paul Snyder. And no one seemed to really like this guy. And a fellow playmate of Dorothy's also spoke up about her dislike for her boyfriend, Paul Snyder, because they all saw the signs that maybe she was missing or she had just grown accustomed to, or maybe it was her young age, but they could clearly see the possessiveness, the dependency, and the way Snyder inserted himself into every part of her life and her career. And it was annoying to everybody around her that she couldn't see it, but they could. And like many stories like this, the warnings just weren't enough. She did not see it, or because she's a Pisces by nature, she was just very soft-hearted and sensitive, and maybe she wanted to fight for the underdog. In this case, her boyfriend was the underdog. But because what looked like love on the surface was slowly beginning to resemble something darker, something much darker. And in the next part of this story, that control would turn into obsession. So before we get into what exactly happened next, we need to look at Paul Snyder under the magnifying glass, okay? Let's go through a little bit of his background, because stories like this don't just happen. They build slowly, quietly, underneath the surface. And if you really want to understand what happened to Dorothy Stratten, you have to understand the man that was watching her ride while he was falling apart. Paul Snyder was born April 15th, 1950 in Aries. He was also born in Vancouver, Canada, a fellow Canadian. And on the surface, his early life doesn't stand out as anything extraordinary. Nothing that I could find online anyway. But by the mid-70s, Snyder had already built a reputation for himself, not as a success story, but as somebody who was constantly chasing one. He worked as a nightclub promoter, and he was a hustler by all accounts and by everybody that knew him. He wore fur jackets, He wore tight jeans, which was cool and flashy back in the 70s. He was someone who lived on the edge of legitimacy. So he didn't actually have a record at the time of him and Dorothy meeting, but he was known to law enforcement. And he did work as a pimp back in Vancouver, Canada. So you could see that he had this opportunist personality. And he did have a history of exploiting people for personal gain prior to getting with Dorothy. So Snyder was not driven by passion. He was driven by image. He wanted money, he wanted status, and he wanted power. But the key detail here is this: he didn't build things, chased shortcuts. Get-rich-quick schemes became a pattern in this guy's life. At one point, he even tried to make money by building and selling exercise benches. One of these was actually found at the crime scene that we're going to get into later, and it was not used for exercise. So, this exercise bench, that was just one of many attempts for him to strike it big and kind of hold down some form of long-term work for this guy. And when all of those ventures failed, he looked another way. That's when Dorothy entered his life and everything changed. So when Snyder met Dorothy Stratten, he didn't just see girlfriend potential. He saw monetary potential. He saw something that he could mold, something that he could control. Remember, she was 9 years younger than him too. And ultimately, he believed that she was also something that he could own. He is the one who orchestrated her entry into Playboy. He pushed her into the spotlight. And when she succeeded, he attached himself to that success. So they moved to Los Angeles. They got married, eloped in Las Vegas in 1979. But behind that image of a rising couple, there was a growing imbalance because while Dorothy's career was taking off, Snyder's wasn't. So as Dorothy became more successful, the power dynamic between these two began to shift. She was working, she was earning, she was building a real career for herself, and Snyder, he was falling behind. Now, financially, he relied on her completely. Dorothy supported him throughout their marriage. And for someone like Snyder, that kind of dependence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was threatening because control was everything to him. So, by 1980, Dorothy had reached a new level of fame. She was named Playmate of the Year. She began working on the film They All Laughed, which was directed by Peter Bogdanovich, a big-time Hollywood movie producer at the time. And during that time, their relationship began to break down. Dorothy started to see a different future for herself, one that didn't include Snyder. So the two separated, and that's when things took a much darker turn in the story because Snyder didn't just accept it. He reacted. After the separation, Snyder hired a private investigator to follow Dorothy. Think about that. At this point, this wasn't even about love anymore. It wasn't even about control. It started to become about obsession and possession. He had this inability to let her go and leave him blowing in the dust. He watched her from a distance and she moved further away from him emotionally, financially, and the more distance that she created, the more unstable he became. And this is where everything starts to escalate because while Dorothy Stratten was building a new life for herself, remember, she's on set with Peter Bogdanovich filming They All Laughed. Paul is back in LA. She is in New York. They are separated. She's building this nice new life for herself. She's finding independence and stepping into her future. But Paul Snyder is spiraling. He's obsessed. He's watching. He's waiting. So by the spring of 1980, everything was changing for Dorothy and Paul. Not all at once, but it really started when she met Peter, the movie producer, at the Playboy mansion. He did pursue her. He did offer her a role in his next movie. She kind of avoided him, didn't even give him a call. Dorothy was beginning to pull away from the man that had built his entire identity around her. So on March 22nd, 1980, Dorothy flew to New York City. This wasn't just another trip. This was a turning point for her. She was beginning work on what would become her final film. This film was They All Laughed, a romantic comedy directed by Peter Bogdanovich. For Dorothy, this role meant something more for herself and for her life and her future. It was her first major role in a big budget film. In a detail that feels almost haunting, Bogdanovich later revealed that he had based parts of her character's story on what he had learned about her real-life marriage.
You're very emotional. Emotions are terrific. Besides, nobody can help how they feel. Uh-oh, now here's the problem.
What's that?
You're married, right?
Right.
Well, that line's a little short. It's weak, but that's not what I'm worried about.
No?
There's a bad romance here.
Oh, really?
Very bad. You see this line? It goes nowhere.
Boy, it doesn't leave me with much, does it?
Well, now, I don't know. There's something new right here. It's very promising. You see this line? It goes on forever.
Maybe that's my skating line.
Your skating line? No, that's your true passion line. But you see, it's clear of the marriage line. It doesn't start till... Are you getting a divorce?
You're getting very personal, aren't you?
Sorry, I'm very sorry. It's just that you've got to be clear of these...
I've got to go.
You do?
Well, thanks for the reading. Do you have a phone?
Do I have it? Yeah, Trafalgar 33901.
Bye.
Can you remember?
So for the first time in a very long time in her young life, it was a little under 2 years of constant togetherness with her boyfriend and now husband, Paul. Dorothy had space when she was working on this film. Back in Los Angeles, Snyder had been everywhere. He was her driver, he was her manager, and he was a constant presence in her life. But that presence came with tension because with Paul in her marriage, it was constant arguments, constant criticism, and constant control. People around her had noticed it and started commenting to her about what they had noticed. And on set, at Playboy, even among friends, and now in New York, that pressure was gone. Snyder had wanted to come with her to New York. He insisted, but this time Dorothy had said no. And I think what you're going to learn shortly is also that Peter, the movie director that had given her this role to begin with, also had something to do with not letting Paul come and stay for the 5-week shoot that Dorothy was doing for this movie, They All Laughed. He was an admirer of Dorothy. He had a plan to take Dorothy from Paul. There were also reports that Peter had his staff screen calls to the production and wouldn't allow calls from Paul to come through to her. So Dorothy had told Paul that the set would be closed to cast and crew members only, and he could not come. And for once, she did create distance between them. Maybe it was distance that those wheels were set in motion by Peter to begin with, but Dorothy did definitely set a boundary there. And I think that really got on Paul's nerves because remember, prior to this, over the last 2 years, he was her everything and controlled everything that she did. So with that distance came something else for Dorothy. For her, it was total freedom. Just a day after arriving in New York, Dorothy and Peter Bogdanovich began an affair. And while she was building something new back in Los Angeles, everything was starting to unravel for Paul. So in April, Dorothy had briefly returned to California after shooting the film. They all laughed. She stood in front of the press, she celebrated, she was admired, and she was awarded Playmate of the Year. So Hugh Hefner not just praised her beauty, but during his speech, he also praised her for her intelligence, her sensitivity, and her uniqueness. But something crazy in regards to Hugh Hefner and Dorothy's relationship would come out later. And we're going to be talking about that awful claim in just a little bit. But back to the current moment. So she is being awarded for Playmate of the Year. Now, Dorothy herself called this time one of the happiest moments in her life. She was so proud to be crowned Playmate of the Year. And the very next night, she appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. From the outside, everything looked perfect. Let's watch some of the Jimmy Carson show footage now. She talks about getting discovered by Paul Snyder.
How are you? By golly, that's you.
Pardon me?
By golly, that's you. You really are a lovely young lady.
Thank you.
I saw you were on the news last night, I think, on the local newscast. Did you know, how long before did you know that you were selected as Playmate of the Year?
Well, we started shooting the issue sometime in October of 1979.
Right.
And we finished in March of 1980.
Right.
So we shot for quite a few months.
Yeah. You received, it used to be in the early days, I remember the gals would get a few little prizes, but this year you got quite a bunch of things, right?
I got a $65,000 Russian sable fur coat and a $25,000 check and a $26,000 Jaguar and a $13,000 bathtub. And
What would a $13,000 bathtub, I mean?
It's made of brass. It was handmade, and it has 4 jacuzzi jets on the inside. It fits about 10 people.
Oh, how lovely. What are we going to tell the other 8? Not to... Yeah. You're from Vancouver, I mentioned. Well, now, what did you do in Vancouver? Were you a professional model at all before?
No, I just graduated from high school when I was approached by Playboy, and I was working in a telephone company. I was a clerk typist.
You're putting me on.
No, I worked there just 6 weeks before they carried me away.
That was good move. The only good thing that ever came out of the telephone company. Somebody said, what's this business of working in an ice cream stand?
I worked there for 4 years, part-time while I was going through high school.
Right.
And one day this gentleman walked in with this gorgeous blonde, this long fur coat, and
right.
I had him waiting on him at the Dairy Queen, 2 little pigtails and a little red smock on, and I said, "Can I help you?" And he says, "What's your name?"
Good.
And it happened from there.
It's like something you would hear in a movie, right?
Yeah.
And they said, "Come to Hollywood." And were you a little reluctant? Did you think maybe it was some kind of a trick or something?
Oh, well, when I was being asked if I would, Playboy was looking for a 25th anniversary girl then, so it was a big contest. And when I was asked if I would pose for the magazine, I couldn't talk to my mother about it because she was in Europe, so I had to make the decision on my own. And my boyfriend, who's my husband now, just said that it was the best thing for me to do, and so after about 3 weeks, I finally decided I would.
Yeah. Now, what are you going to do with all your money? I think I read in Playboy that you're going to buy property or something?
Yeah, I'd like to buy some real estate, a house somewhere out of the city.
Yeah. Are you going to stay out and live in California?
Mm-hmm. I've been living here for a year and a half now.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you something. They've made surveys that when men look at magazines like Playboy, and obviously men find women attractive, They say that men, well, what I'm saying is, the point I'm getting at, and I'll get there in a moment, that men are more visually stimulated by seeing the female form without clothes than women are. Now, there are magazines that came out, I think there's a Play Girl, in which they ask men to pose nude. Do women generally have the same reaction if they see a pretty male? You guys stay out of it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, speaking for myself, I think a male is sexier, showing a little bit or some. I mean,
that's all right. I'm with you.
In a bikini or trunks, or rather than
being completely.
Nude. Yeah.
Really?
So, behind the scenes, the situation with Snyder, her husband, was deteriorating very fast. While Dorothy was on a promotional tour in Canada, she began to express something that she hadn't before. She wanted freedom. In letters to Snyder, she asked for space. She wanted her independence. But distance only made his behavior worse. And when he called her, he often became enraged. And when her tour ended in Vancouver, he showed up unexpectedly. He inserted himself back into her life, whether she wanted space or not. He was not respecting her need for space, and he was not going to let her shut him out. Once again, here's Paul taking control and even collecting money from her appearances. Remember, narcissists are masters at exploitation, and they take what they want because they think that, well, they're just entitled. So he was known to call her in rages, to not respect her emotional boundaries, and he was also known to take money as he pleased from her wallet. At one point, during a heated argument between the two, Dorothy offered something heartbreaking. She said that she would give up her career, Hollywood, everything. She suggested that maybe they should just start over, go back to Vancouver, and pick up where it all began. Maybe she could go back to working at the Dairy Queen, but they'd have each other and they would be happy. But Snyder refused her offer. Because by this point, it wasn't just about saving the marriage. He doesn't want her to stop taking off her clothes to earn them money. He wants her to keep working, but he wants to be right there by her side, controlling everything that she does and being inserted. So what it came down to was his control was slipping away. And why would he go back to Canada at this point when she's landing roles, she's making money for them? So by late June, just weeks after their first wedding anniversary, Dorothy had made it official. They were separated, physically, financially, and emotionally. Snyder's reaction was immediate and very telling. He threw into a rage and he emptied out their joint bank account and he began acting out. He was convinced that Dorothy was involved with somebody else. He hired a private investigator, not to reconnect, not to understand, but to confirm his fears. So this private investigator was following her around and reporting back to Paul on her comings and goings. And yeah, so as the summer went on, Snyder's situation grew worse. He had no stable income. He had no legal ability to work in the United States because he was a Canadian. He did not have his green card. And now, to make his situation even more dismal, he had no control over Dorothy. The only control he had at this point was the private investigator following her around. He turned to desperation. He started selling off her belongings. Even her Playmate of the Year prizes, including a luxury Jaguar, just because he needed the quick cash. So now we are in mid-July. So mid-July, filming for They All Laughed had wrapped up. Dorothy had spent some time in England with Peter Bogdanovich. And when she returned to Los Angeles on July 30th, everything had changed because now she had her own apartment in Los Angeles. But in reality, she had already moved on because she was quietly living in Beverly Hills with Bogdanovich. She was starting over, and she had every intent to plan a new life for herself, away from Paul Snyder's control and abuse. So by the end of July of 1980, this was no longer about a failing marriage. This was like a done deal. Dorothy was completely done with Paul. This situation was sitting on the edge of violence because Paul was just so filled of rage, and he was having a hissy fit that he had no control over his girl anymore. And this is someone who thrived on control. He loses it completely, and people like this don't always walk away. Sometimes they just escalate. And Dorothy, being the sweet, kind, and caring woman that she was, just never really cut him off fully. She always had this guilt around leaving with him, and she really wanted them to remain friends, and she wanted to find a place of understanding with him. So, on the night of July 31st, Paul Snyder made a decision that, in hindsight, feels like a point of no return. So he knew that Dorothy was back in Los Angeles. And more than that, thanks to his private investigator, he also knew that she was now with Peter. So he went to the director's estate, not to talk, not to reconcile or win Dorothy over from this man, but he went there armed. He hid outside of the property in the shadows, carrying a borrowed handgun. He was waiting, watching, planning, and his intention to shoot anyone who walked out through that front door. This wasn't impulsive, this was planning on his part. He went there the last day of July in 1980, 2 weeks before this tragic day that I'm still leading up to. I'm going to talk about it, and the crazy claim against Hugh Hefner that's coming up. But 2 weeks prior to this tragic day happening, he was outside of this movie producer's home, armed and ready to shoot whoever walked out of that house. So no one walked out of the house. He ended up leaving. He just got tired, impatient, who knows. So he drove up into the hills overlooking the city, and he later admitted to a friend that he had thought about ending his own life that night. Just a week after this happening, on August the 8th, 1980, they saw each other again for the first time in 3 months at their former home that they shared together in West Los Angeles. Snyder walked into that meeting confident. He had done it before. I mean, he persuaded her to pose for Playboy magazine when she was very young and working at Dairy Queen. He had persuaded her to trust him, to marry him, and he believed that he could do it all over again. But this time was different. Dorothy didn't hesitate. She told him the truth. She let him know point blank that she was in love with someone else. She wanted to move on and made that clear to Paul. And she wanted to finalize their separation and their divorce. And just like that, the illusion shattered, and Dorothy had nothing left to hide. But of course, for Snyder, this wasn't just rejection, it was the total loss of his control and his successful hustler future that he had created for himself using Dorothy's good looks and skills. So, I mean, everything went out the window. His identity, his sense of power, it all had been tied to Dorothy. And now it was just gone. It was like she was taking it away from him by filing for divorce. But still, he persuaded her to meet him one last time. he wanted to discuss their financial settlement because he was her husband and he was entitled to some of her fortune. But beneath his claims that he just wanted to discuss financials, something else was brewing under the surface. And less than a week before her murder, he returned the gun that he had borrowed. Remember when he went to Peter's estate and he waited outside? He had returned the gun that he had borrowed. And almost immediately, he became fixated on getting another one after having this conversation with his wife, Dorothy, about their separation. So, over the next several days, people had described his behavior as becoming increasingly bizarre and alarming. Everyone, aside from his roommate, Patty, who had stated on the morning of August 14th, he seemed fine and happy. But on August 9th, he had gone to a gun store with the private investigator that he had hired to follow his wife, Dorothy. But there was a problem. As a Canadian citizen, he couldn't legally purchase a firearm in the US. So he had to convince the investigator to buy one for him. But the investigator refused and said, no, I'm not buying a firearm in my name for you. And hello, thank God, he had sense to say no to this guy. But the next day he had tried again, and this time he was asking for something even more extreme. And what he asked for at the store was a machine gun. He wanted to purchase a machine gun, claiming that it was for home protection. But again, he was talked out of it, and as a Canadian, he was not allowed to purchase a gun at the store. But that did not stop him. He kept on trying. Just a couple days later, on August 11th, Snyder drove out to the San Fernando Valley, and he had found a gun for sale in a newspaper. So he was determined now. He was focused. But something almost eerie happened. He got lost. He couldn't find the address. And eventually he had given up and he went home. It's one of those moments that you think in hindsight, how would things have turned out different if that path would have kept on, or if he would have just given up and not been so tenacious in this revenge plot of his? But we can dream, but it didn't happen that way, of course. So by August 13th, 1980, there was no longer a question of what would happen, but when it would happen. Because after several days of searching with no luck in finding a firearm that he was so desperately trying to acquire, Paul Snyder finally got what he had wanted, a weapon. This time, he secured in a private sale a 12-gauge shotgun, not just a handgun, a shotgun. So on August 13th, which happened to be exactly 2 years after Dorothy Stratten first arrived in Los Angeles with Paul Snyder to go to the Playboy mansion, Snyder purchased a 12-gauge shotgun from a private seller. Later that evening, he mentioned it casually to friends. And he started joking that he was going to take up hunting, but that conversation didn't stay casual. It turned dark. He began talking about death and about former Playboy playmates who had died, including Claudia Jennings. He made morbid comments after getting his hands on this shotgun, and also was talking about how quickly the world moves on after someone passes away, about how even tragedy becomes something to manage. And of course, it's always in hindsight, those weren't just strange remarks. They were warnings. So the next day on August 14th, Dorothy prepared for what she believed would be one final step forward for her. That morning, she met with her business manager, not her husband. She has a new legit business manager at this point. And she wanted to make sure that Paul was happy with what she left him. And police would later find cash among her belongings. including $1,000 that she had brought as a down payment. There was a way out. This was a clean break for her, and she was just trying to do it the right way. In fact, when her manager suggested that she avoided meeting Snyder altogether, and also that a lawyer could handle everything, Dorothy said something that still stands out to people this day. And she wanted to handle it personally. She thought it would go easier that way, and she didn't want to further enrage Paul. She thought that this was a respectful way to end their marriage. And she also added to her manager that she would like to remain his friend. So at around noon on August 14th, she arrived at the house in West Los Angeles, the same house that they had once shared as a married couple. This time they were alone. Snyder's roommates were all gone, and by all appearances, things probably seemed calm when she got there. I mean, her purse was later found in the living room, open, as if she had just set it down, expecting a conversation. At some point, they had moved into the bedroom, and that room is where everything changed. Paul Snyder's roommates had returned home. They saw that Dorothy's car was parked outside in the driveway, and the bedroom door was closed. They assumed that the two of them were maybe reconciling and just privately alone in the bedroom together, so they did decide to give them some privacy. And they went to the living room and they watched television for some time. They waited. Hours had passed, and they didn't hear any sounds coming from the bedroom. No one came out of the bedroom, and it was a little bit strange. So a private investigator, the same one that Snyder had hired, grew concerned after not hearing from Paul. He called the house, and shortly after 11 p.m., the roommates had ended up entering the room because they didn't hear a sound and they were starting to get a little concerned. So as soon as they went inside the bedroom, they found both Dorothy and Paul Snyder completely nude, and Paul was face down on the floor. Both had been killed by a single shotgun blast. Now, according to investigators, Dorothy had been killed within an hour of arriving, and sometime after that, Paul had took his own life. So, I mean, Dorothy got there thinking that they were going to be cordial, they could remain friends. She was willing to give him whatever money he required from her just to keep things okay between the two of them. And his response was to sexually assault her, and also he had shot the shotgun at her face. So there was no chance of her having an open casket. I mean, I feel like that was just so awful. And remember at the beginning of this story, I had said that he had taken up a get-rich-quick scheme to build exercise benches. Well, there was an exercise bench in his bedroom, and apparently they did not use it for exercise. It was actually used for sexual purposes, and there was evidence on there that she was tied to that bench at some point, because they did find pieces of white cloth where she was tied to this sex bench, and there was strands of her blonde hair on it. And like I said, they were both nude. So, I mean, just absolutely awful. Just awful. So the news spread very quickly. I mean, that night, a call was made to the Playboy mansion. Hugh Hefner was informed. He then told Peter Bogdanovich, who collapsed upon hearing the news about what had happened to her, brutalized by being sexually assaulted by him and then also being shot in the face by him is just awful. But Dorothy's mother was also notified the next morning at her home in Canada. And I mean, a life that had just begun ended at just 20 years old. Dorothy was 20 years old. Paul Snyder was 29. So remember earlier when I mentioned that there was something disturbing between Hugh Hefner and Dorothy Stratten's relationship that I did want to touch on a little bit. 5 years after Dorothy's death, Peter Bogdanovich wrote a book called The Killing of the Unicorn, where he outlined several deeply troubling claims that Dorothy had allegedly shared with him. One of the most shocking claims that Dorothy had shared with him was an incident that happened at the Playboy mansion. According to Peter, Dorothy told him that one night near the jacuzzi at Hugh Hefner's home, Hefner made a sexual advance toward Dorothy, and a sexual advance that she rejected. And it quickly turned into an assault, a sexual assault on Dorothy. So this is not the first allegation that was made against Hugh Hefner. He has consistently denied any wrongdoing in relation to Dorothy, at least when he was alive. He frequently denied it. While he has publicly expressed heartbreak over her tragic and early death, and he's often commented on her resemblance to Marilyn Monroe, which he firmly rejected these accusations. But when the book was first released, Hefner pushed back hard. He accused Peter of being manipulative and made serious allegations in retaliation of his own against Peter. One of these shocking claims is that Peter had an inappropriate relationship with Dorothy's younger sister, Louise, who was only 13 years old at the time of Hugh Hefner's claims. Hefner suggested that Peter was trying to replace Dorothy with her sister. Now, Hugh Hefner has said repeatedly that Peter Bogdanovich was completely smitten, carried away, and obsessively in love with Dorothy. To counter these claims, an interview was later conducted by Geraldo Rivera with Louise, Dorothy's younger sister, where she addressed the accusations by Hugh Hefner directly.
No, not at all. They're false.
You never had a sexual relationship with Peter Bogdanovich?
No.
LB, why don't you describe your relationship with Peter Bogdanovich?
Just a friend. He just always helped me in family matters to do with my sister because my mom can't deal with it.
Why are you doing this interview? Is it to convince your friends that what you're saying is true, or is it something more than that?
It's that, and also to let Hugh Hefner know that not to do this to any more people and just to leave me alone because I haven't done anything wrong at all.
So this interview was in 1985. Peter would go on to marry Dorothy's little sister 3 years after this interview in 1988. I have no words. So Dorothy Stratten was cremated and laid to rest in Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery. On her grave, there reads a passage that was chosen by Bogdanovich from A Farewell to Arms. So her story would go on to be talked about in countless films, documentaries, and there's been countless retellings of this story, including Star 80, where she was portrayed by Marital Hemingway. But beyond the headlines and beyond the Hollywood retellings, there's something deeper here. This wasn't just a tragedy, this pattern, one we've seen many times before in the cases that I cover, and one we still see today, even though this happened in 1980, over 40 years ago. It still happens today. And we have a young woman who was kind, trusting, and full of potential, who crossed paths with someone who didn't just love her, but needed to control her. At first, it looked like support, attention, devotion, but slowly it turned into utter obsession and control. And I know somewhere inside Dorothy, she was ignoring those warning signs at the beginning of the relationship. But I mean, life pans out in ways that are unexpected. And honestly, if she hadn't met Paul Snyder, we probably wouldn't be here talking about her today, because there's a good chance she never would have been famous if she hadn't went down that path to begin with. But the hardest truth here is that the warning signs were there, People saw them, people spoke up, they tried to intervene, but sometimes by the time everything becomes clear, it's already too late. And in the end, the world that Dorothy was pulled into is just so unsettling to me, because not one of the men in this story truly seemed to have her best interests at heart. Instead, she was surrounded by people who exploited her, abused her, benefited from her, controlled her, and saw opportunity and exploited her vulnerability. The accusations didn't stop after her death either. The claims that Hugh Hefner made about Peter Bogdanovich were later complicated by the fact that Peter married her little sister, Louise. Paul Snyder, in the meantime, refused to let Dorothy even walk away from him. And it's like she wasn't just his partner. I mean, she was his whole life and his livelihood. And the allegation surrounding Hefner wasn't isolated to Dorothy alone. Similar claims have surfaced throughout the years against Hugh Hefner, especially since his death. And I firmly believe that he would have been part of this Me Too movement. And if you want to explore this further, I highly recommend that you look into watching Secrets of Playboy, because Dorothy's story, as tragic as it may have been, it's only a small part of the bigger picture here. And there's lots of other victims. It wasn't just Dorothy. So if this story taught us anything, it's really to take those warnings a little bit more seriously. And what warning signs really stood out to you here? Let me know in the comments what warning signs really stood out in Dorothy Stratten's story. Thank you for being here. Thank you for honoring Dorothy's story with me. And remember to trust your instincts always. I'll see you guys next week. Thanks.